They used to say that in Siberia you didn't need walls. The snow, the distance, and the silence were enough. In some of the most remote labor camps, there were no barbed wire fences at all because the men who ran them didn't believe anyone could cross hundreds of miles of taiga, tundra, and swamp and live long enough to tell the story. On the official books of Stalin's secret police, though, those same empty miles show up in a different way, as columns of escaped prisoners who were never recaptured, numbers that in many cases were simply a bureaucratic way of saying he died out there. Between 1929 and Stalin's death in 1953, roughly 18 million people passed through the Soviet camp system in one form or another. Gulag camps, colonies, prisons, and internal exile. Millions of them died in custody or shortly after release. Careful studies of Soviet records suggest at least 2.5 million deaths directly attributed to incarceration, and the real figure is very likely higher. In the early 1940s alone, Gulag documents show about 4 million people under some form of confinement, including around 1.5 million in labor camps and over 400,000 in penal colonies. In that ocean of forced labor, escape looks at first glance surprisingly common. Between 1934 and 1941, NKVD statistics list a gap of 122,176 between the number of prisoners recorded as having escaped and those recorded as recaptured. In other words, more than 122,000 inmates who, on paper, broke free of Soviet custody and vanished. In the earlier years of the 1930s, similar records show about 600,000 deaths and roughly the same number of fugitives in just a couple of years. To an uncritical eye, it might look as if Siberia was full of successful runaways. The reality was darker. Camp commanders were under pressure to keep mortality rates down, reporting that hundreds or thousands of prisoners had died of hunger, cold, or overwork could bring the attention of superiors they did not want. Reporting that the same men had escaped, on the other hand, shifted the blame to the prisoners themselves. Historians who have gone through the ledgers in detail now believe that a significant share of those fugitives were not people who broke out and kept going. They were people who collapsed on a worksite, froze on a march, or slipped under the ice of a mine pit, and whose bodies were never brought back to the gate. Even when a prisoner did vault the fence or disappear from a work brigade, he didn't suddenly step into a world of choices. In many camp complexes, especially those above the Arctic Circle, there was nothing beyond the perimeter except more snow and sky. A journalist who visited former Gulag sites in Vorkuta noted that some of the most remote camps had no wire at all, not because the regime was merciful, but because the geography did the job. It was accepted wisdom that anyone who tried to run would be dead of exposure or starvation long before reaching a village big enough to have a train station. That didn't mean no one tried. Across decades of camp memoirs, literature, and testimonies, a pattern emerges. There were always men willing to gamble on the taiga. Most never made it. A few did. Their stories are the spine of this episode. First, you have to see the terrain through their eyes. Many camps were in places people would never have gone by choice. Kolyma in the far northeast, Norilsk above the Arctic Circle, Vorkuta on the edge of the frozen Pechora Basin. Even in milder Siberian regions, winters meant weeks at 40 below, winds that could tear the skin off your face, and darkness that seemed to start mid-afternoon. In summer, the taiga turned into a different kind of enemy. Endless bogs, rivers bursting with meltwater, and clouds of mosquitoes so thick that people tied rags over their faces just to be able to breathe. Now, imagine facing that with the body of a Gulag prisoner, underfed, wrapped in thin cotton or threadbare wool, feet in boots whose soles had long since separated from the uppers. Your days are 10 or 11 hours of swinging a pickaxe, felling trees, shoveling coal, or pushing ore carts. You sleep in barracks crammed with lice and disease. You may have scurvy, you almost certainly have chronic hunger, you have no map, no compass, and almost no food to take with you if you run, and you know that if you are caught, the penalty will be savage, extended sentence at best, a bullet or a noose at worst. Given all that, why did anyone run? The answer lies in human psychology as much as in geography. For some, the day comes when the monotony and hopelessness of the camp become unbearable. The barbed wire, the guards' insults, the slow death of the body. At some point, the risk of running into the forest with a stolen crust of bread feels less terrifying than another winter in the mine. Varlam Shalamov, the former prisoner who wrote the Kolyma tales, put it bluntly: escape, for many, was simply another form of suicide. The methods were brutal. One of the starkest details in modern reportage from former Gulag regions is an old inmate rumor: if you wanted any chance in the deep Taiga, you escaped in a group of 3. Not because 3 sets of hands could build a better shelter, but because the third man was the cow. The idea, recounted by residents and former prisoners decades later, was that 2 strong inmates would choose a weaker third as their meat reserve. If they couldn't find other food, they would kill and eat him. It sounds like horror fiction. It appears often enough in survivor accounts that historians take it seriously, as evidence of how desperate and dehumanizing conditions had become. Historically, the idea of fugitives wandering Siberia is older than the Gulag. In the 19th century, under the Tsars, Siberia was already a dumping ground for exiles and forced labor. The writer and activist Pyotr Kropotkin estimated that more than 20,000 prisoners escaped from Siberian penal colonies in his era. The ethnographer Nikolai Yadrintsev thought the number of vagrant exiles roaming the Taiga could be as high as 50,000 at any given time, a shadow population of half-starved men living off theft, begging, and occasional charity, many of them dying unknown in the woods. Villagers would sometimes leave loaves of bread on windowsills at night so fugitives could take them without anyone having to talk, preserving a fragile line between compassion and deniability. Under Soviet rule, that uneasy dance became much harder. Helping an escaped prisoner was not just frowned upon, it was a ticket to your own camp. Yet even then, in memoirs from the 1930s and 1940s, you catch glimpses of loggers or lone hunters quietly sharing a meal with a stranger who was almost certainly on the run, then watching him disappear back into the tree line. Often, those small acts weren't enough. And yet, against all of this, there were men who made it. Most of the ones we know about didn't escape from the heart of Siberia to Paris or New York. They escaped from the fringes of the Gulag archipelago to the nearest non-Soviet state, Finland in particular. Take the case of Ivan Solinec. In the early 1930s, he was a journalist and monarchist sympathizer arrested for planning to flee the USSR and sent to one of the harshest labor camps. The exact location shifted as he was transferred, but one of his stops was in the northern forests not far from the Finnish border, in Karelia. From there, his plan was breathtakingly simple: get himself and his family out of the camp, then use the woods as a shield to walk to Finland. He and his son tried twice and failed, once because of illness, once because the boy developed appendicitis. The third time, he did something no one in the NKVD expected. He volunteered to organize a camp-wide sports competition. He sold it as a morale booster. The commandant bought it. Over the next weeks, the supposed sports organizer traveled between different parts of the camp, talking to prisoners and guards, planning events. In reality, he was memorizing terrain, guard routines, and the weak points of the system. On July 28, 1934, the plan went live. Solinevich's youngest son, Boris, had slipped away 3 days earlier. Ivan himself and his older son, Yuri, left the camp under pretexts spaced a few hours apart and rendezvoused in the forest. From there, they headed northwest, away from roads, sleeping in underbrush, skirting villages, and living off whatever they could steal or catch. What should, on a map, have been an 8-day trek through thick Karelian forests took 16 days of slogging. When they finally stumbled across the Finnish border, exhausted and half-starved, local border guards told them Boris had passed through 2 days before. The three were reunited on free soil. Ivan's wife never made it out. Her fate remains unknown. If that sounds like a one-off, consider Solovki. The Solovki Islands in the White Sea were home to one of the earliest and most notorious special-purpose camps in the Soviet system. Isolated by frigid water that rarely rose above 7 degrees Celsius even in July, ringed by rough seas and patrolled by Soviet boats, Solovki was as close to an inescapable fortress as the planners could dream up. And yet, in 1925, a former White Army officer named Sozerko Malsagov proved that even here, the combination of human will and local knowledge could punch a hole. Malsagov and a handful of other prisoners were sent to the mainland to work in the forests, felling timber. There, among the moss and pines, they found the one thing Solovki's walls of water didn't have: gaps in human attention. On May 15, 1925, Malsagov and his group overpowered their guards, seized their weapons, and bolted north into the forest, aiming for the Finnish border. He later described walking 24 hours at a time through sodden ground, low scrub, and endless bogs, sleeping only in snatches, ears straining for the sound of pursuit. Several weeks later, after crossing what he called no roads, only swamps and small rivers, they made it into Finland. From there, Malsagov told his story to the world in a book titled An Island Hell. A few years later, another Solovki alumnus pulled off an even more improbable break. Vladimir Chernivin was a zoologist charged with sabotage in a Soviet cannery and sent first to Solovki and later to Kandalaksha, a camp on the White Sea coast. Because of his scientific skills, he was assigned to choose and supervise new fishing grounds. That job required him to move between camps and coastal sites, sometimes with light or no escort. He used that relative freedom the way Salinevich had used his sports competition, to study routes and memorize weaknesses. In August 1932, when his wife and young son were finally allowed to visit him, he decided that none of them were going back to the official barracks. Years later, he summarized the choice like this: "We escaped from the labor camp, risking the life of my wife and my son, with no weapons, no warm clothing, in terrible shoes, with almost no food. We crossed a sea gulf in a leaky boat that I patched up myself. We traveled hundreds of kilometers without compass or map, far above the Arctic Circle, through wild mountains, forests, and terrifying swamps. They survived. They crossed a body of subarctic seawater in a patched-up boat, then walked and scrambled their way through trackless northern terrain until they found Finnish territory and eventually asylum. For the guards who realized what had happened, it must have seemed like something out of an adventure novel. For the family, it was the only way out of a machine that had already taken so many years from them." Not all long escapes went north. During and after World War II, as Soviet forces rolled westward and swallowed Eastern Europe, new groups of prisoners ended up in camps far from home. Some of them decided that any direction that got them closer to their own borders was better than freezing in a barracks. One striking example that has been reconstructed in recent years is the story of the Ivanovsky brothers, Anton and Viktor. They were Polish soldiers in the Home Army who fought the Nazis and then found themselves arrested by the Soviets in what had been Eastern Poland and was now Soviet-controlled Lithuania. Deemed politically unreliable, they were sent deep into the Soviet interior to a string of camps and work sites around Kaluga, southeast of Moscow. In 1945, they escaped. They stole a small rowboat on a river, most likely the Oka, and used it to get away from the immediate orbit of the camp. From there, they headed west, hitch-rode illegally on freight trains, slept in fields and forests, and moved mostly by night. Their improvised route took them through Gomel in Belarus, then Vilnius, then Warsaw, and finally to Wrocław, in what is now western Poland. In total, they covered about 1,300 miles, roughly 2,100 kilometers, on foot and in Stalin rides, dodging both Soviet security and the general chaos of post-war Eastern Europe. Decades later, Anton's grandson would repeat the journey as a photographic project, showing abandoned factories, bare birch groves, and endless winter rail lines, the background against which his grandfather had bet his life. And then is the story that for many Western readers defined the very idea of a Siberian escape, The Long Walk. Published in English in the 1950s and widely reissued later, it was credited to a Polish officer named Sławomir Rawicz, who claimed to have escaped from a Siberian Gulag in 1941 and walked all the way to British-ruled India. The book describes a group of 7 prisoners, Poles, a Latvian landlord, a Lithuanian architect, an American engineer, and later a teenage Polish girl, who break out of a camp he calls Camp 303, some 650 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. Without maps or proper gear, they supposedly trekked 6,500 kilometers over 11 months, across Siberian forests and steppe, through the Gobi Desert, over the Himalayas, and into India, where British Gurkhas find them half dead in 1942. It is a gripping story. It inspired documentaries and a film, The Way Back. It also, as historians eventually discovered, does not fit the records. Soviet and Polish archives show that Rawicz was amnestied after the German invasion, released in 1942, and routed with many other Poles through Central Asia to refugee camps in Iran, not walking through Tibet. In 2009, the BBC tracked down a different Polish veteran whose wartime path and partial notes more closely matched the long trek described in the book, suggesting that the narrative may be a composite of multiple lives. Either way, The Long Walk has to be treated today as, at best, an embellished or misattributed account. Yet its enduring popularity says something important. People in the West wanted to believe that it was possible for a human being to simply start walking out of a Siberian camp and by sheer will reach freedom. Against that myth, the real stories of Solonovich, Malsagov, Chernovin, and the Iwanowski brothers stand out all the more starkly. They are smaller in scale, hundreds of kilometers rather than thousands, but they actually happened. They show that, in a system designed to use geography as a weapon, there were still cracks for those who understood the land, watched their guards closely, and were willing to risk not just their own lives, but their families' lives on the chance that Western technology and law would be waiting on the other side. That last part mattered. None of these men were running into a void. They had some sense, blurred by propaganda but sharpened by rumor, of what lay beyond the Soviet border. In Finland, they would find a government not controlled by the Kremlin, a society where private property still existed, and ports where foreign-flagged ships came and went. In the case of Polish escapees, they hoped eventually to reach territories controlled by the Western Allies, where American logistics and British imperial routes moved men and supplies around the world in volumes the Soviet rail network could barely dream of. For a prisoner who had spent years in a camp where a broken truck might sit unrepaired for months because parts were scarce, stepping onto a Swedish or British or American vessel must have been like stepping into another century. Engines that started reliably, radios that worked, lights that came on at the flick of a switch and stayed on, food served from steam tables in metal trays, not from buckets in a filthy mess shack. Onshore, in cities like Helsinki, Stockholm, or later in North America, they saw tram lines, busy shops, and apartment blocks with central heating. The contrast between that and the barracks they had left behind, the mud, the lice, the broken stoves, was not theoretical, it was visceral. Back in the Taiga, the Soviet state kept grinding. Even after Stalin's death, the camp system took years to unwind. Some camps were closed, others were reclassified. Prisoners were released in waves, only to find themselves dumped in remote settlements with little means to reach the European parts of the USSR. The landscape itself retained the shape of the old archipelago, abandoned barracks, rusting watchtowers, and villages whose only real link to the rest of the world was a single deteriorating road or a winter ice track. Today, in some of those places, life remains isolated. Journalists who visit former Gulag zones in the Russian far north describe communities where people still live in decaying camp housing, where unemployment is high, and where the nearest real hospital or university is an expensive plane ride away. The Soviet Union may be gone, but its use of geography as a blunt instrument of control has left scars, demographic holes, ruined infrastructure, and a lingering sense that for some citizens, the country is still a kind of open-air penal colony without the formal paperwork. For Americans watching these stories, there's a particular kind of fascination in tracing the path from that world to their own. The Gulag system was a product of an industrial dictatorship that boasted endlessly about its dams, factories, and trains. It could build huge metallurgical complexes and send Sputniks into orbit. But when you look at the lives of the people at the bottom, prisoners whose boots fell apart, whose barracks roofs leaked, whose escape options boiled down to die slowly here or die faster out there, you see the limits of that model. The rare prisoners who made it through the Taiga and over a border did not just survive. They crossed an invisible technological and moral frontier. On one side, a state so fearful of its own citizens that it turned entire regions into no-go zones and used weather as a weapon. On the other, societies where the same cold and distance were challenges to be solved by better ships, better radios, and better logistics. On one side, prison camp statistics where dead men were rebranded as escaped to protect bureaucratic reputations. On the other, immigration records that, however imperfect, tried to keep track of human beings as individuals rather than as lines on a monthly report. There was never a Hollywood-style mass breakout from a Siberian gulag, ended with a convoy racing into an American base, flags flying and bands playing. What there was, again and again, were small, desperate bets against the snow. A man slipping out through a work detail, a family rowing a patched-up boat across dark water, two brothers stealing a skiff and following a river until they could jump a train. Most of those bets failed. A handful paid off, in Finnish border posts, in DP camps under UN signs, and in American and Canadian cities where former prisoners found themselves living in worlds full of things the propaganda back home insisted did not exist. Those few successes don't erase the millions of lives ground down by the system that made them necessary, but they do something else. They show that even in a place designed to make resistance pointless and escape impossible, human beings kept pushing toward whatever faint line of light was visible on the horizon, and that when they did manage to cross that line, they found a very different relationship between people, power, and technology waiting for them on the other side.